Margaret Chen wiped down the last table of the night, her feet aching from a 12-hour shift that had started before the sun came up, and showed no signs of ending even now, when the restaurant was nearly empty and the kitchen crew was already joking about going home. She was 34 years old, a single mother of two, and she had been working at the Golden Fork for 6 years, long enough to remember when the tips were better, when the owner actually walked through the dining room, when the staff felt like a family instead of a group of strangers, held together by a shared exhaustion. Tonight had been particularly brutal. Table 7 had sent back their food 3 times. A child at table 12 had knocked over an entire pitcher of orange juice, and Margaret had smiled through it, cleaned it up without a word of complaint, and brought a fresh one at no charge. A man in a gray suit had snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog, and she had bitten her tongue so hard she tasted metal. But none of that was what broke her. What broke her was the phone call she received on her 10-minute break, the one from her son's school, telling her that Daniel needed new hearing aids because his old ones had finally stopped working, and that the cost would be nearly $2,000, and that without them he was sitting in the back of his classroom, unable to hear a single word his teacher was saying. Margaret had held it together through the rest of her shift, through the dessert orders and the final round of coffee and the slow parade of customers filing out into the cool evening air. But the moment she pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen and saw her co-worker, Rosa, looking at her with that particular expression of quiet, understanding that only someone who has also struggled can recognize, something inside her gave way. She leaned against the stainless steel counter and pressed her hands to her face and cried, not the quiet, dignified kind of crying, but the deep, shuddering kind that comes from a place you have been keeping locked for a very long time. She cried for Daniel and his silence. She cried for the rent check that was already late. She cried for the version of herself that had once had plans, real plans, before life had handed her one hard thing after another and asked her to keep smiling while it did. What Margaret did not know, what she had no possible way of knowing, was that the man who had been sitting in the corner booth for the last 2 hours, the one in the plain blue shirt and the worn jeans, the one who had ordered a simple meal and tipped quietly and asked her twice if she was doing okay, was not just a customer. His name was Robert Ellison, and he was the founder and CEO of Ellison Hospitality Group, the company that owned the Golden Fork and 43 other restaurants across the country. He had been conducting an undercover assessment of his locations for the past 3 weeks, walking in without announcement, sitting like an ordinary guest, watching how his staff was treated and how they treated others. He had seen a lot in those 3 weeks. He had seen managers cut corners and hosts turn away customers and line cooks work in conditions that embarrassed him. But he had also seen Margaret. He had watched her absorb every difficulty of the evening with a grace that he found genuinely humbling. He had seen her kneel down to help the child with the orange juice, laughing gently to make the parents feel less mortified. He had seen her hold her composure when the man in the gray suit spoke to her like she was invisible. And before he left, just before he put on his jacket and headed for the door, he had quietly asked Rosa if everything was all right with Margaret. Rosa, who trusted her instincts about people, had told him everything. Robert did not leave. He sat back down, pulled out his phone, and made 3 calls. The first was to his HR director, authorizing an immediate bonus of $5,000 to be deposited into Margaret's account the following morning, with a note that said simply, "For everything you carry and everything you give." The second was to a hearing specialist his company had worked with on an employee wellness program, arranging for Daniel to be seen within the week, all costs covered. The third was to his own chief of staff, asking that Margaret be formally considered for a newly created role, floor manager of guest experience, a salaried position with full benefits and hours that would let her be home when her children needed her. When Margaret came out of the kitchen, composed and a little embarrassed, she found an envelope on table 12 with her name written on the front. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "You showed more dignity tonight than most people manage in a lifetime. Your son is going to hear clearly very soon, and your story is just beginning." She read it 3 times, standing alone in the empty restaurant, and then she pressed it to her chest and looked up at the ceiling the way people do. when they are trying to say thank you to something larger than words. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner Stories, where every story reminds us that a single act of grace can change everything.